You assured us this construction was safe. Now look at it, my property value is ruined.
Ma'am, the structural integrity is holding.
They called my great-grandfather's 80-year-old stoneware an eyesore and a liability, so they destroyed it while I was busy getting my daughter married. I came home from Autumn's reception, the perfect, crisp autumn night, to find 80 years of hand-cut North Carolina limestone reduced to a ragged pile of rubble, raw creek water rushing fast and loud where a gentle flow had always been, and the thick, sickening smell of diesel fumes hanging in the evening air. That controlled flow, the one that had protected our valley since 1943, was wiped out in just 4 hours by a woman who'd moved here from the coast 2 years ago. I found Vivian Sterling, the HOA president, standing on her pristine deck, sipping what looked like celebratory champagne, watching the unleashed water flood straight into her own subdivision's storm drains, the irony completely lost on her, I think. The official notice was taped to my mailbox. $12,000 in unpaid infrastructure fees for a structure that existed before her precious Crestwood Landing neighborhood was even a developer's fever dream. Here's the one thing they don't teach you in HOA president school, or maybe in any office that deals with nature. Water always wins. And I'm Ethan Stonefield, retired Army Corps engineer, Zeke to anyone who's earned the right to skip the formalities, and I was about to give that water some very specific, educated directions. What would you do if some petty, temporary official destroyed something your family built with their own hands? Seriously, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and tell me the single worst HOA horror story you've ever had. I need to know I'm not alone in this kind of beautiful, crazy fight. I'm the third-generation owner of 15 acres that my great-grandfather, Elias Stonefield, carved out of the Northern Carolina wilderness back when men solved problems with determination and engineering know-how, not with lawyers and homeowners associations. Elias built that we're in 43 with huge blocks of local limestone. No mortar, just precisely fitted stones that had been doing their job, holding back seasonal floods, managing the creek flow, for 8 decades. Every spring, you could hear the soft, controlled trickle of water over those worn stones, and the wet limestone smell mixed with wild mint growing along the banks. I inherited more than just property when Elias passed. I got his stubborn streak and 23 years of Army Corps training. After 3 combat tours and a medical retirement, I was perfectly content living in our modest farmhouse, watching my daughter Autumn grow up right where bullfrogs sang their evening concerts, and afternoon light filtered through the oak branches like nature's own stained glass. Then, Crestwood Landing sprouted up around us in the late 90s, popping up like toxic mushrooms after a rain. Cookie-cutter houses for people who thought rustic charm was something you bought at Pottery Barn. Our functional creek became their decorative water feature. Our flood control became their eyesore. Most neighbors were decent people, honestly, but every subdivision needs its queen bee, and ours came with a Porsche and the social skills of a particularly aggressive hornet. Enter Vivian Sterling, former city planning consultant, current HOA president, and the future author of My Deepest Migraine. She maintained a yard so sterile it could double as a surgical suite and had perfected the art of smiling while mentally calculating how much your family's history was costing her property value. The first shot was fired 2 months before Autumn's engagement. "Mr. Stonefield," she said, standing on my porch in linen pants that probably cost more than my monthly disability check, "we need to discuss your property's integration with our community standards." Integration, like I was defective software that needed an update. "Ma'am," I replied, watching her dismiss the hand-carved porch posts with the same expression you'd use for roadkill. "My property was here before your community existed." "That's precisely the problem," she countered. She pulled out a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. "Your rustic infrastructure poses significant safety concerns. Especially, it's creating liability exposure. And frankly, Mr. Stonefield, some residents find your lifestyle incompatible with our investment protection." My lifestyle? Code for you people don't belong here. The scent of her expensive perfume couldn't quite mask the odor of pure, unadulterated contempt. I offered a compromise, regular inspections, minor repairs, whatever it took to keep the peace. But Vivian had that predatory glint in her eyes, the one people get when they've already decided you're the nail and they're bringing the pneumatic hammer. Her first truly petty act, she called Child Protective Services, claiming my property was unsafe for children because Autumn still visited with her fiancé's kids. Anonymous tip, of course, but the timing was surgical, right during the final wedding preparations. The harassment campaign had officially begun, and Vivian had just declared war on 4 generations of my family's stubborn legacy. But she had miscalculated one thing about retired military engineers. We don't just build things to last. We build them to survive people exactly like her. 3 weeks after the CPS visit, which, thankfully, ended with the social worker apologizing for the obvious malice, a certified letter arrived that made all the previous harassment look like amateur hour. $15,000 in retroactive infrastructure fees for my 80-year-old weir. I read the legal gibberish twice, the rough paper crinkling in my hand as I processed the sheer, unbelievable audacity. According to their HOA consultant, Marcus Finch, my weir was negatively impacting downstream water management systems and required immediate remediation assessment fees. It was logic twisted into a pretzel. My weir, which had been perfectly controlling the flow since before their subdivision existed, was somehow retroactively responsible for the expensive improvements they'd made to handle the massive runoff from houses that never should have been built on a known floodplain in the first place. It was like blaming the lighthouse for the rocks hitting the shore. I had 30 days to pay or face remediation proceedings. Translation: pay up or we'll destroy your family heritage with the enthusiastic efficiency of a toddler with a bulldozer. But here's where Vivian made her first big, expensive mistake. I'm a retired engineer who believes in documentation. A quick Google search on Marcus Finch, hydrology consultant, revealed something my old Army Corps buddies had drilled into me. Always check professional credentials. Turns out, Mr. Finch was licensed in Georgia, but he was practicing consulting in Northern Carolina without proper state credentials. That simple license verification had just saved me 15 grand and handed me a legal sledgehammer of my own. My counterpunch was swift, surgical, and extremely public. I filed a complaint with the state licensing board about unlicensed practice, demanded itemized breakdowns of every alleged improvement the fees were supposed to cover, and requested full HOA budget transparency at their next monthly meeting, right in front of 63 residents who suddenly realized they might be funding their president's personal, extremely expensive vendetta. The aroma of strong coffee brewing during my late-night research sessions mixed with the satisfaction of watching Vivian's airtight plan spring its first major, structural leak. Vivian's reaction was exactly what I'd expected, spectacularly stupid. She fired off passive-aggressive emails about harassment, scheduled emergency board meetings, conveniently excluding non-residents like me, but the damage was done. Longtime residents, like Mr. Harrison, a retired teacher, started asking pointed questions about why they were paying emergency assessments for legal battles they never voted on. Mrs. Elena, a sweet widow on a fixed income, started showing up at my door with copies of her suspicious HOA invoices, a look of growing realization that she'd been systematically played. The community was fracturing along the lines of those who clung to their property values and those who were just plain tired of the lies. Then, the final move. Vivian issued a 48-hour emergency abatement notice. She claimed a sudden inspection revealed catastrophic structural deficiencies requiring immediate demolition. The timing was pure psychological warfare, scheduled for the Saturday of Autumn's wedding weekend, assuming family obligations would keep me distracted. She thought I'd be forced to choose between my daughter's happiness and my family's 80-year legacy. She was about to discover that engineers don't just design structures to withstand natural disasters. We design them to survive human ones, too. And I'd been planning for this exact storm since the day she first knocked on my door. The morning of Autumn's wedding, a perfect October day, dawned crisp and clear. I was adjusting my dress uniform, thinking about walking my daughter down the aisle, when the sound of heavy machinery shattered the peace like a wrecking ball hitting a glass cathedral. 6 a.m. diesel engines roaring, the unmistakable hydraulic whine of excavators warming up for destruction. I stepped onto my porch, fully dressed, and saw them. A demolition crew surrounding my grandfathers were like vultures at a buffet. Vivian was there, too, in designer boots that had never seen honest dirt, clipboard in hand, directing the operation with the gleeful efficiency of someone who'd timed this moment for maximum emotional devastation. Emergency safety order, she announced, waving a document like a conquistador's flag. Structural inspection revealed immediate collapse risk. We're protecting the community from your negligence, Mr. Stonefield. The crew was already positioned. Their lead operator looked about as comfortable as a vegetarian at a butcher's convention. I approached, my dress shoes crunching on gravel that would soon be mixed with 80 years of history. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite the pure, incandescent rage building inside me like steam pressure in a boiler. "I'm going to need to see that emergency order and the inspection report that triggered it." Her smile was colder than a tax audit. "The safety of this community takes precedence over your sentimental attachments, Mr. Stonefield. This structure is a liability we can no longer tolerate." But my engineers, I caught something on the paperwork that made my blood pressure spike. The dates didn't match reality. The inspection supposedly triggering this urgent demolition was 3 weeks old, and the work permit she was brandishing was an expired county authorization from an unrelated project 6 months ago. "Folks," I called out to the growing crowd of early arriving wedding guests, "y'all might want to document this. Mrs. Sterling is about to commit what appears to be the destruction of private property using fraudulent paperwork during a family celebration. She'd made a catastrophic error in her timing. Today wasn't just Autumn's wedding. It was the day she'd invited 150 witnesses, including a retired federal judge and a military chaplain, to watch her destroy my family's legacy. The first hydraulic claw bit into the limestone that had weathered 8 decades of North Carolina storms. The sound was deafening, sickening, like civilization itself breaking apart. Clear, controlled water that had flowed peacefully since 1943 suddenly rushed wild and unrestrained, carrying away topsoil and decades of careful erosion control, like nature's own immediate revenge. Within 2 hours, what had taken my great-grandfather months to build was reduced to rubble and muddy chaos. The ceremony had to be relocated. Autumn's white dress hem was stained with creek mud, and the guests were now furious witnesses to what looked increasingly like premeditated vandalism disguised as municipal authority. The texture of my daughter's muddy dress as I helped her navigate the disaster felt like holding evidence of a war crime committed against my family's most sacred moment. But Vivian's arrogance had failed to anticipate one thing. Midwestern and Southern wedding guests don't passively watch family heritage get bulldozed. The entire guest list became instant, highly motivated advocates, armed with smartphones, recording every moment of bureaucratic savagery. That evening, as we cleaned up the wreckage, wind-blown documents from the flooding, literally blown out of Vivian's own yard during the chaos her own destruction had unleashed, were scattered across my property. I smoothed out the soggy papers on my kitchen table, the same oak surface where 3 generations of Stonefields had solved family problems, and the musty smell of wet paper mixed with the bitter aroma of my morning coffee. I realized the flood had delivered something more valuable than revenge, a confession written in her own handwriting. This wasn't about safety, liability, or community standards. This was about covering up theft. Document after document revealed payments to a shell company, Sterling Solutions, for landscaping work that had never been performed, maintenance that never happened. $200,000 in pure, unadulterated embezzlement. The weir demolition was a necessary distraction and a financial scapegoat. Destroy the weir, blame the resulting flood chaos on failed pre-existing infrastructure, and use the insurance payouts to replace the stolen money while painting me as the negligent property owner. Desperation had made Vivian sloppy. Email timestamps showed she'd been planning the insurance fraud before the demolition. And the final smoking gun, buried in a folder marked Emergency Reserves, were bank transfer records showing HOA funds flowing to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Because nothing screams legitimate neighborhood association like international money laundering operations. My environmental law attorney, Rhea Vance, reviewed the evidence. "Ethan," she said, "this isn't simple embezzlement. We're looking at wire fraud, mail fraud, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Federal prosecutors will be fighting over who gets to try this case." The power dynamic had just executed a complete reversal. I wasn't defending my property against HOA overreach anymore. I was sitting on the evidence that would send their president to federal prison for decades. We let her continue digging her own grave. Our coalition, the retired teacher, the widow, the former board member, worked with FBI agent Grimm, who was already investigating financial crimes and who Vivian actually hired as a private investigator to find dirt on us. The irony was delicious. Her final, desperate gambit, an emergency community safety meeting held at the flood-damaged community center. She hired off-duty police officers, organized a social media blitz of paranoia, and planned to flee the country immediately afterward. The stage was set for her final performance, surrounded by the physical evidence of her crime. She arrived in a rented Bentley, looking the part of the powerful, concerned leader, completely oblivious that the majority of the residents, media crews, and even her hired security detail were all part of the trap. She launched into her propaganda, denouncing extremist elements and dangerous veterans, while standing on a water-stained stage, talking about protecting property values. 20 minutes in, her overconfidence peaked. "I personally authorized the removal of that dangerous dam structure," she declared, gesturing dramatically. "Because community safety takes precedence over sentimental attachments." The admission was recorded by multiple cameras. That's when I stood up and approached the microphone with the calm pace of a predator who'd cornered its prey. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the damaged room. "Thank you for confessing to the destruction of private property on camera. Now let's talk about something really interesting, like the $800,000 in HOA debt you've been hiding from these residents." The silence was absolute. "And the $200,000 you've stolen from your neighbors' pockets through fake invoices to shell companies you control? Should we discuss that on camera, or would you prefer to wait for the federal agents to read you your rights?" Vivian's face drained of all color. She screamed, "Those are lies. Security, remove these troublemakers." But her security detail was already noticing the unusually large number of suited residents displaying federal badges. Agent Grimm stepped forward, calm and professional. "Mrs. Vivian Sterling, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud." The sound of handcuffs clicking closed echoed through the sudden, stunned silence like the final note of a very expensive symphony. Spontaneous applause erupted from the residents who finally watched justice arrive, with federal badges and proper procedures. Local news cameras captured every moment as Vivian was escorted from the building she damaged, past the neighbors she stole from, toward a federal courthouse. She'd managed to commit 3 additional federal crimes during her final speech, including obstruction of justice and making false statements to the federal officers she'd unknowingly hired. Vivian pleaded guilty, receiving 5 years in federal prison and a multi-million-dollar restitution order that would follow her for the rest of her life. The community used the recovered funds to rebuild the weir, combining my great-grandfather's original limestone with modern, flood-proof engineering. We replaced the toxic HOA with a transparent, democratic neighbors association that hosts monthly potluck meetings. Standing up to a bully doesn't just save your own property when you do it right. It saves entire communities from people who mistake temporary authority for permission to steal. The creek flows clear over restored stone, carrying the promise that water always finds its proper course when good people refuse to let corruption dam the flow of justice. Share your own HOA horror story in the comments. You might help someone else fighting similar battles against financial corruption disguised as community improvement. Do you think the punishment fit the crime? Should neighbors have the power to overturn HOA rules entirely? Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people defeating corrupt systems. Next week, the story of the city council that tried to seize a family farm for a shopping mall, and how one stubborn farmer used a 200-year-old property law to turn eminent domain proceedings into a federal investigation of municipal corruption.